Hi everybody, want to do a second woodworking practical lesson on various aspects of woodwork, and today we're going to be thinking about two subjects. The first is health and safety in relation to hand tools, and the second subject is going to be on the use of string. We're going to do what's called string theory. No. So first of all, we're thinking that we're going to talk about woodworking safety with tools. If you're going to be working with an employer, most people do work with an employer, then health and safety is very important. And your employer, especially if there's more than 5 people, will have a duty to have a health and safety risk assessment for the workplace. And a risk assessment is just basically a list of all the hazards in the workplace and also the measures that will be taken to minimize that risk and to control and manage that risk. So that's what a health and safety risk assessment is. If you're working entirely by yourself, it's still good practice. Even if you don't necessarily write it down, it's still good practice if you just have a moment or two to think before you start a project, to make sure that you've thought about all the risks associated with using hand tools. Hand tools are not toys. They can be dangerous. They can be used in such a way that brings hurt, okay, to yourself or to other people. And that's very, very important feature. In the first regard, with hand tools, we need to think about personal protective equipment. Now, and nowadays everyone talks about PPE, and we're talking about things that protect you from the hazards of the workplace. So, for example, you might have things flying towards your eyes, and what you would do there is you would have a pair of goggles on your eyes to protect your eyes from splinters and from things that fly. The next thing you might have is you might have things on your ears to protect you from noise in the workshop. Very often, joiners get to the end of their life and they've worked in noisy environments all their life and they're really quite deaf. This is it's a gentle thing, but it produces long-term damage to hearing. Okay. The other thing that might be important is a mask. A mask is just designed to keep your breathing. It doesn't take away all of the risks of breathing, but it takes away some of the dangers of breathing dust. Some dust is exceptionally bad for you. Other dust is not quite so bad. So, all dust is not going to be good. The next thing we need to talk about is loose clothing. When you're working with machinery or when you're working with tools, you don't want to have long sleeves that can dangle or even get caught in a machine and pull you into it and cause a danger, pulling you towards the cutter, for example. So as you can see, I'm a person that likes to bear arms. I believe in bearing arms because I find that this is safer this way. In the woodworking regulations in the UK, it's a stipulation that people don't wear rings when they're doing woodwork or when they're using machinery because of the risk of that catching on a machine and it pulling you. A lot of people lose fingers that way, and it's quite a dangerous thing. Also, trailing earphones is something that's particularly bad. If it gets wrapped into a machine and the machine is traveling fast, it can pull your face down towards dangerous cutters. So loose clothing and anything, in fact, jewelry, something around your neck. Lanyards, for example, can be particularly dangerous. You need to make sure you have a lanyard that when you pull it, it will break into two behind your neck. The next thing about using woodworking tools is always secure your work. Always clamp it down. I work on a table, I'm going to show you just now. I work on a table that actually has these features on it. It has holes so that you can put clamps in and you can clamp your work down. I can also clamp it onto the front of the table. This particular table is designed specifically for doing small woodworking projects. Now, it goes without saying that when you're working with cutting tools, that you keep your fingers away from them. There will be time when you're sharpening, there will be time when you're working whereby you'll nick your finger, especially if the tools are very sharp. They've only got to just touch your finger and you'll get a cut immediately and you'll start bleeding. And it's very important not so much to wash the wound out, it's very important to bind it up in such a way that the blood stops flowing. Okay, you'll become good at that. And of course, the other risk using woodwork is the question of splinters. When you're working with rough timber, especially if you're working with some hardwoods, they can be nasty, nasty splinters. Just remember that all splinters are dangerous. All of them are not clean, and it's going inside your body. So it's very, very important. No matter how much it hurts, it's very important to use a needle and to get it out in order to get yourself completely clear of infection. Splinters almost invariably go bad in the end, and they hurt a lot. But if you carry a needle with you and you learn to be able to dig around the sides of the splinter, then you will be able to extract them. When you're working with blades, for example, a chisel or a plane, you never would run your finger along the blade. That may sound obvious. If you run your finger along the blade, it's going to cut it. That's what blades do, they cut. However, if you pass your finger across the blade in the opposite direction, this is very often a way whereby you can check that tool, the sharpness on that tool, as to how much it pulls on the skin as you just put it across the surface. But that's about the only time that you would ever touch blades and touch the tips of blades. You never touch the tips of a saw, for example. All of these tools can cause harm. They're not toys. They need to be treated with respect. Now, another feature of using hand tools is you must never take a tool and force it into the wood. If it's having to be forced, or if a saw is having to be forced, or if a plane is having to be forced, it just means that they're blunt and they need to be sharpened. If you're using tools correctly, they shouldn't need a lot of force. They shouldn't need a lot of pushing. And that's a big thing about using hand tools. Now, the next thing is you need to make sure that you're using the right tool for the right job. Now, I see, for example, people picking up quite a big hammer to put in little tiny nails, or they use a tiny little hammer to try to put in really big nails. Well, of course, that's all wrong. What we need to be doing is using a hammer that's the right weight for the nail. And of course, we'll talk about the different types of hammers that we use eventually, and we'll illustrate them all for you so that you can see exactly how nails are put into wood. The other thing to consider is that when using any woodworking tools, in fact, when doing any woodwork, we keep the area clean and tidy. We don't allow offcuts to just land at our feet. We pick them up and put them in the bin. We don't want to trip on one. We don't want to stumble and fall into the tool bench or fall into tools. We don't want other people to be coming around our workshop and actually stumbling because there's tools around the place. We don't want that. We want to keep the place clean and tidy. It will be a stipulation of health and safety that you do keep your workplace clean and tidy. We're going to be looking at a number of tools over the next few videos. We're going to be talking about measuring tools. We're going to be talking about marking tools. We're going to be talking about saws, and I'll be demonstrating the saws for you. We're going to be talking about planes. We're going to take some planes to pieces and put them back together and set them up in such a way that they work just right. We'll also be teaching you during these videos how to get them really sharp, because obviously a plane has to be very, very sharp. There's a lot of features about a plane that we need to learn. And then we'll be talking about chisels, and then we will finally be talking about drills. Okay, so these are the 6 main tools. But before we move on today, we've had a little bit of a theory thing there. Before we move on today, I want to talk to you about one of my favorite tools. and it's a piece of string. You know, when I was a joiner many, many years ago, I used to be always amazed by the older guys. They always had a piece of string in their pocket, usually a big lace or a big piece of string, and they would use it for all sorts of purposes. And I'm going to show you two types of tools that can be used with string, and there's other things that we can do with string. There's so many things that we can do with string. Now, you may not have seen one of these before, but this is called a plumb bob. Okay, it's a plumb bob, and the great thing about a plumb bob is that it always is perfectly upright. So if you're measuring here and you're measuring there, you're able to get something to be perfectly upright. And sometimes in my life I have another version of this, and if I'm doing walls and I want to put the nail holes for putting nails in or screws, then I will put a little loop at the top and I'll hang it on a nail, and when I hang it on the nail it will always fall perfectly level. And then I can flick the string and it'll put a line down the wall, and that line will be perfectly upright. Okay, now piece of string, amazing thing. I'm going to show you another version of it. Let me just let the camera come down a little bit so that you can see when I'm working on this table exactly what I'm talking about. So this is it's a string line. You'll notice that first of all it can also be used as a plumb bob. Okay, just the same as the other plumb bob, but this particular one is in a plastic case that's full of blue chalk, and that's particularly useful. If I want to, for example, draw a perfect line across there, I could look around for a ruler, I could look around for a straight edge, but I could just as easily use a piece of string. The amazing thing about string is that if you pull the string very tight, that string will always do a very straight edge. You see that? You just put it on and you flick it and put it on whatever you like, and it will always do an absolutely perfect straight line. So this is a particularly useful tool. One of the great, I was working on a building site one day and they had a bucket full of rusty nails and a big long length of string. Okay, and that big long length of string, it was steeped in rainwater with lots of nails in the bottom that were rusty, so the water was red from rust. And all they did when they needed to make a very straight line and mark a straight line, they would take the string out and it would be covered in red dusty water, and they would literally pull it tight each end and flick it, and that water would flick onto the surface and it would make a dead straight line. So let's remember that the people who built the pyramids, the people who did the technology of very ancient times, they used simple tools. They used a piece of string. A piece of string. Many years ago, I don't happen to have one with me at the moment, but many years ago, when I first started as a carpenter, I couldn't really afford a spirit level. So what I did is I got myself a plumb bob. The plumb bob cost me something like about £3, which was quite a bit of money in those days, and it was suspended on a piece of wood. So it was cut into the surface at the top. Near the bottom was a big circle where this plumb bob would hang. And I can tell you that with some practice, that plumb bob was an excellent way of being able to work out a vertical. You wouldn't think that would be, it's such a simple thing, but it's an excellent thing. And it can also, of course, be used for getting a horizontal. And you say, how do you make a plumb bob get a horizontal? Well, one day I was working with George, and George was an absolute whiz of skill and knowledge from years back. And we had to transfer a mark that was 10 foot apart. 10 foot apart. And I said, how are we going to do that, George? He said, go and get one of those big sheets of plywood. I want a 10 by 5 sheet. And I went, okay. So I went to get this 10 by 5 sheet, And what he did is he got his string and he marked down the middle and he flicked it to produce the line. That's, holding it this way, he did a line down the middle. Then he put his Plumb Bob on the top, and we lifted the sheet up, and you could see immediately when the Plumb Bob went exactly straight on the line. So we were able to use the Plumb Bob to produce a horizontal datum point. Now that is clever, isn't it? Some of these old guys, they didn't, we tend to think that they were old-fashioned, but they had ways and means, and they had skills that were incredible. Well, there we are. That's our thing for today. We're gonna, every time we do one of these practical videos, we're gonna have two subjects. So today we've had the subject of health and safety with hand tools, and we've also had the subject of using string. By the way, remind me sometime, I'm going to do a video on how to use string to produce a perfect 90-degree angle. Now that's fascinating. That's a very, very interesting thing. So we'll talk about that on a future video. Great to see you. Look forward to seeing you on the next video. Bye for now.